If I could go back, Eveene, I wouldn't have married you. Those words cut through the silence of the kitchen like a sharp knife. Thomas Harper did not shout. There was no anger in his tone, just something worse, resigned coldness. He didn't even look her in the eyes as he spoke. He simply continued stirring his coffee with slow, deliberate motions, as if commenting on the price of milk or the weather. Eveene said nothing, not for lack of feeling, but because something inside her, perhaps the last spark still fighting, shattered quietly. She rose without haste, pushed the chair back, and climbed the stairs, her heart pounding like a muffled drum. The bedroom looked untouched, as if unaware of the sentence just passed. The bed was made, her robe hung exactly where it always had, and the scent of her nighttime cream still lingered in the air. 40 years of shared life, 40 years of lunches, birthdays, bills paid, hands held in hospital corridors, swallowed silences, and endless waiting. Eveene walked to the wardrobe and pulled down the dark green suitcase she'd last used when visiting the little chalet her grandmother left behind. The very suitcase Thomas had called too old for one more trip. The dust on the zipper seemed to confirm that she had indeed forgotten she could leave. She began to pack the suitcase as if embalming a body, carefully, reverently, with contained sorrow. She chose her most comfortable clothes, the thick sweater she wore on cold mornings, the low-heeled shoes that didn't rub against old calluses. She placed inside a small photo frame holding a picture of Sarah and Noah when they were still children, the reminder of when everything still made sense. But what made her pause was the burgundy leather journal resting beside her writing desk. Inside were dozens of letters Eveene had written over the past 20 years, letters never sent. To Thomas, to her children, to herself. Words that never found a voice. Her hands trembling, she picked it up and flipped through the pages slowly. He came home late again today, said it was a meeting, didn't even look at dinner. Noah didn't call me on my birthday. Maybe he forgot. I tried talking to Sarah, but she said I make everything complicated. Each page stood as a silent witness to the erasure she endured day in, day out. Eveene hesitated, thinking of leaving the journal on the bed like an epitaph to the woman she once was. But no, it was still hers. She closed it tenderly and tucked it into the suitcase's side pocket. Her pain was not a gift. It was a reminder. Downstairs, Thomas sat at the table, staring at his coffee cup. He didn't seem sorry, nor relieved. He seemed empty. He did not ask where she was going. He did not try to stop her. He did not say her name, and perhaps that stung the most. Eveene slipped into her gray coat, swung her bag strap over her shoulder, and grabbed the key hanging by the door. She left without making a sound, because at that moment, she understood. Silence had always been this house's official language. She merely decided not to speak it anymore. The morning air was icy but pure, and the April sky had that cloudless blue hue that only appears when everything falls apart. Eveene placed the suitcase in the back seat of the car and settled the journal beside it in the passenger seat, as if taking an old friend on a long journey. She started the engine. No neighbor peered over the fence. No gate creaked open. The world carried on as usual, and that hurt too, realizing that not even her departure would be remembered by anyone around her. But in her chest, a whisper began to grow, small, yet steady. You still exist. She did not know exactly where she would go. She had Nora, her friend of decades, who lived alone in a little house near the mountains, and there was her grandmother's forgotten chalet, an old, moldy structure, but hers nonetheless. Thomas had always called it a nuisance, too remote, too rustic, totally useless. But in that moment, Eveene felt that perhaps everything labeled a nuisance was precisely what she needed, and maybe, just maybe, she would begin there, in a place where she could breathe without asking permission, where her letters, at last, could be read, if only by herself. As she drove through the city streets, Eveene felt the weight on her shoulders lessen with every corner passed. It wasn't lightness yet, it was pain in motion, but at least now she was the one choosing the direction. The radio played an old folk song, and wind rushed in through the slightly open window, tousling strands of her hair. For the first time in many years, she wasn't late for an obligation. She wasn't packing diapers, or food, or medicine, or anxiety. She was carrying only herself, and for the first time, that seemed enough. Eveene had met Thomas when she was just 24. freshly graduated in literature, full of plans, living in a small apartment above a bookstore. He was a substitute lecturer at the same university, and, unlike the men her age, seemed centered, stable, sure of himself. She fell in love first with the way he explained poetry, then with the way he straightened his shirt collar before stepping into class. Their courtship was brief and peaceful, without grand gestures, but with quiet promises of a safe life, and perhaps that was what most drew her. The idea that with him there would be no risks, only certainty. They married in early autumn, beneath the golden trees of a small chapel in Maplebridge Falls. Eveline's dress was simple, borrowed from a cousin. The reception was modest, featuring an apple pie made by her mother and wooden tables Thomas helped set up. At that time, he still wrote her letters on her birthdays, sometimes slipping notes between books on the shelf. He was a quiet man, yes, but attentive in his own way. She believed love could be silent too. And when Sarah was born 2 years later, Eveline quit her job to devote herself entirely to the home. "It's for love," she repeated to herself. "It's what good wives do." The years that followed were a silent dance of everyday sacrifices. Eveline prepared his breakfast just the way he liked. Eggs firm, toast barely toasted, coffee with 2 drops of milk. She looked after the children, washed clothes, mended school uniforms, planned birthday parties for themes Thomas deemed over the top. Over time, he stopped giving his opinion, and then he ceased to notice. When Noah arrived 3 years after Sarah, she had already become a woman who measured the success of her day by the number of tasks completed, never by the quality of what she felt. For a long time, that was enough. On Sundays, she could still coax a smile from him by reading passages from novels or sharing old childhood stories of their children. But little by little, those moments grew rare. Thomas withdrew into his own interests: politics, academic articles, finances. He said he needed silence, and she obliged. He said he was tired, and she understood. He said she worried too much, and she fell silent. Eveline became an expert at translating silences, at anticipating gestures, at filling absences with sweetness. When Sarah went off to university, the house felt too big. Eveline missed the noise, the sound of the TV playing, hurried footsteps in the hallway, laughter drifting from the next room. She thought that with the children grown, she and Thomas would have time to rediscover one another. She'd read about couples who traveled together, tended gardens, and picked up new hobbies. But Thomas simply sank deeper into himself. He began dining alone, ignoring simple questions, answering only in monosyllables or not at all. Eveline felt like a shadow in the hallway, someone who performed tasks but occupied no emotional space. Despite it all, she tried. She experimented with new recipes, hoping for his reaction. Sometimes he ate without comment. Other times he said it was too seasoned or too bland. Eveline bought cookbooks, new perfumes, floral sheets to break the monotony of their bedroom. She joined the local library's book club, and on the nights she returned home, she still longed to hear, "How was it?" But it never came. When she mentioned feeling tired, Thomas told her she needed to keep herself busier. When she confessed her loneliness, he rose from the table and said she was dramatic. One evening, she prepared his favorite dish, lamb stew with golden potatoes. She spent hours in the kitchen. It was their wedding anniversary. He arrived late, carrying a new book but no gift. He said, "Good evening," and headed straight to his study. Eveline ate alone, then washed the dishes to the sound of the radio, her hands immersed in hot water, trying to convince herself it was just a phase, that he loved her. He simply didn't know how to show it. That love could be quiet, harsh, and her mission was to endure. She'd grown up hearing that strong women knew how to wait, but what no one taught her was what to do when waiting turned into absolute silence, when birthdays ceased to exist, when the partner with whom you'd built an entire life looked you in the eye and said, "If I could go back, I wouldn't have married you." In that sentence, there was not just contempt. There was a total erasure of who she had been, all she had built with calm hands and a steady heart. And now, behind the wheel as she left the city streets behind, Eveline felt she was also leaving something else, the role of an extra in her own story. Thomas's 70th birthday was one of the first events where Eveline realized she was there only as the organizer, not a part of the celebration. Sarah handled the invitations, chose the expensive modern restaurant downtown, hired a photographer, and decided there would be no speeches, because that's outdated, Mom. Eveline spent the morning of the event helping with preparations, sewing up the hem of Sarah's dress that had come undone, and reprinting the menu after the printer made errors. Upon arrival, Thomas entered smiling, greeted by retired colleagues and friends. No one mentioned that it was Eveline who'd attended to all the forgotten details behind the scenes. During dinner, seated next to a distant cousin, she heard praises about how Thomas had been an example of professionalism, consistency, and strength. Grace, her teenage granddaughter, barely offered a greeting. Noah chatted about investments with a friend. Sarah, always busy, whispered to her that Eveline stressed over nothing, murmuring it as if calming her mother were a burden. When dessert arrived, a lemon tart Eveline secretly baked because it was Thomas's favorite, he took a bite, made a subtle face, and pushed the plate aside, murmuring, "Too sweet." It was a slap, disguised as taste critique. Later, when someone proposed a toast, Sarah took the floor to speak about her father's successful career and how he'd always been a pillar. She said he was the kind of man who didn't need many words to be heard. Everyone applauded. Eveline, hands in her lap, smiled and clapped too. No one mentioned he had never truly been a present father or an attentive husband. That night, back home, Thomas let out a satisfied sigh and said, "It was beautiful, wasn't it? Well planned. Sarah is so much like me." Eveline merely nodded, feeling a familiar weight settle on her shoulders once more, the weight of invisibility in her own life. In the days that followed, Eveline began writing more often. Her letters transformed from sporadic laments into full-fledged diary entries. Each page was like an unsent cry for help. She wrote to a version of herself that might still exist somewhere else. She wrote what she had never said. "Today I tried to tell Thomas I had a migraine and nearly fainted, but he said he couldn't be late for his club meeting. I just nodded and lay down in the dark. Sarah told me I complained too much. Maybe I do, but never. About trivial things. I only wanted to be heard." Noah, meanwhile, was more gentle. He called occasionally, sent photos of his dog, asked if she was okay, but he lived far away and carried a silent guilt. When he visited last spring, he noticed how neglected her garden was, how stooped she walked. He said, "Mom, you need to take better care of yourself." She laughed, as one laughs at a joke you can't explain. How could she take care of herself in a house where no one saw her? How to nourish a body when the soul subsists on leftovers? Eveline tried other outlets. She took 2 pottery classes at the community center, befriending a woman named Hazel, who said molding clay was like shaping chaos itself. She loved the sensation, dirty hands, creating something with fingers and intention. She thought she might return, but Thomas mocked her when she mentioned it. "You? Playing with clay? What will you do, sell bowls at the fair?" She forced a laugh, feigned indifference, and canceled her chuo. 3rd class. She tucked the flyers away and returned to her routine of cooking dinners that garnered no praise and washing clothes that received no thanks. One rainy afternoon, she realized something definitive. Thomas no longer said goodnight. It had been an old tradition, even on the worst days. He would murmur it in a low voice, sometimes already in bed, but he always said it. Now, not even that. Lying beside him, she whispered, "Good night," and waited. Nothing. He was awake, but did not respond. The next day, she said nothing, and with that, silence settled in as a rule. When she tried to talk to Sarah about it, she heard, "Mom, maybe you're dramatizing. Dad is just like that. He always has been." Eveline smiled with the kind of smile mothers use to keep from crying in front of their children. That night, opening her burgundy journal, Eveline wrote, "Today I realize Thomas hasn't stopped loving me. He's simply stopped noticing me. And the worst part is not that. The worst is that I've grown accustomed to being invisible. I have become the furniture of this house, and maybe not even the most useful piece." She closed the journal firmly, looked in the bedroom mirror, and asked herself if there was still time to be more than this. Not a resigned wife, not a mother only called when advice was needed, but someone alive, someone who writes letters, and who knows, might one day start sending them. The brunch had been Eveline's idea. It had been months since Noah visited, and Sarah was always tied up with meetings, school events, and project deadlines. She wanted something simple, just the four of them, like in the old days. She planned every detail with care: stuffed pancakes, spinach quiches, homemade jams, fresh orange juice. On Saturday night, she polished the silverware, laid out the porcelain heirlooms from her mother, and folded napkins into flower shapes. She placed fresh blooms on the table. On Sunday morning, she donned a lilac dress with 3/4 sou sleeves and tied her hair into a loose chignon. For a moment, she felt beautiful. Thomas came down late, wearing a wrinkled polo shirt and engrossed in his phone. He didn't even notice the table setting. He poured himself coffee and said, "No need to go overboard, Eveline. It's just breakfast." She smiled sweetly and replied, "It's just our family. That's always been enough for me." He muttered something inaudible and sat, distracted. Sarah arrived with the children in tow, dropping backpacks by the door. She gave her father a hurried kiss, offered her mother a vague nod, and turned straight to the couch to turn on the TV for the kids. Noah was the only one to embrace her warmly. "It smells amazing, Mom," he said sincerely, and she almost cried right then and there. When everyone finally sat down, Eveline tried to keep the mood light. She lovingly brought out dishes, offered more tea, and asked about the latest news. She attempted to rekindle the warmth that once made her the center of this home. But Sarah barely lifted her eyes from her phone. Thomas, between political comments, declared, "Taxes are killing retirees, and that children should stop relying on their parents for everything." When Eveline mentioned her interest in returning to pottery, Thomas laughed loudly. "You? A potter? Will you set up a stall in the square and live off that now?" Everyone laughed, except Noah. The hardest moment, however, came with an apparently harmless comment. Sarah picked up a pancake, took a bite, and said with a little smirk, "Mom, I think you used the wrong baking powder. It's kind of tough, huh?" Thomas chipped in without missing a beat. "She's consistent in that. Remember when she forgot the sugar in Noah's cake? I said it tasted more like a war effort than dessert." The table erupted in laughter. Even Noah smiled, but only out of reflex, not genuine amusement. Eveline gazed at her clasped hands in her lap, fingers entwined, gripping tightly, trying to contain something, boiling inside. She rose slowly under the pretense of fetching more napkins. In the kitchen, she leaned on the counter, staring at the flowers she put in the vase. She didn't cry. She didn't punch anything. But inside, something gave way. It wasn't an explosive breakdown. It was a subtle surrender, the kind of pain that crystallizes. From there, she heard muffled laughter in the living room, clinking glasses, her children conversing among themselves, and she felt, with the force of incontrovertible realization, that she was not part of that conversation. She was playing a role, and even that role had become the butt of a joke. After lunch, as everyone departed, Thomas gave her a pat on the shoulder and said, "It was great. They had fun." Eveline forced a smile with her lips, but not her eyes. When he went upstairs to the bedroom, she remained in the kitchen, where the late afternoon light touched the white tiles. She sat at the table and opened her burgundy journal. Taking her blue pen, she wrote in firm letters, "Today I understood that I am no longer a character in my own story. I am the secondary joke, the one who forgets the sugar, the one who insists, the one who waits, the one who never gives up. I think it's time to give up." From that day on, Eveline changed. Not radically, there were no loud breakups, but inside, where real transformations occur. She stopped preparing elaborate meals. She cooked for herself simply: scrambled eggs, light soups, chamomile, tea. When Thomas complained, she told him he was free to cook whatever he liked. She began to walk alone through the neighborhood streets, stopping to window shop, taking coffee in unknown bakeries. She bought a blue scarf, simply because she liked its texture. When Sarah called, Eveline said she was busy and would call back later, and sometimes she never did. The silence between her and Thomas, once filled with tension and hope, was now definitive. It was the end of a language. He slept on the sofa more frequently, spent weekends with old colleagues, and asked no questions. None. Not about where she was going, who she was with, or what she was thinking. It was in this new void, a void without promises, that Eveline made her decision. She would begin planning her departure. But this time, it would not be a rehearsal like before. It would be real. and it would unfold in the most dangerous way of all, in absolute silence. On a cold Tuesday in May, Eveline woke before dawn. There was no special reason, only a thought that insisted on remaining. If I don't choose myself now, I will never be chosen. She rose from bed carefully so as not to wake Thomas, though he no longer noticed her even in waking moments. She went to the closet and pulled down the dark green suitcase again. This time, she wasn't merely testing the latch. She was deciding. She placed it on the bed and began folding her clothes with light, almost affectionate gestures. She did not choose the most valuable pieces. She chose those that spoke of who she was, or who she could still become. She selected her favorite sweaters, 2 pairs of comfortable pants, a pair of low-heeled shoes, and her raw wool scarf. In the bathroom, she placed her most used toiletries in an old travel case. She ran her hand across the mirror, where for years she had traced hearts in the steam after her showers, and saw not a defeated woman, but one awakening. On the dresser lay 2 important items: the photo of her young children, grinning with ice cream-smeared mouths, and the burgundy journal. Eveline picked up both. The photo went into an inner pocket of the suitcase. The journal went into her handbag. It would not be left behind. Not this time. Thomas arrived home shortly after lunch, as usual, after meeting an old friend. He found Eveline standing by the kitchen counter, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked serene, wearing a blue sweater that made her seem smaller, lighter, more resolved. He entered, dropped his keys on the counter, and asked irritably, "Did you drop off the laundry? I left a note here." Eveline did not answer immediately. She turned slowly, looked him directly in the eyes, for perhaps the first time in years, and said firmly, "No, and I'm not going anymore." Thomas frowned. "What does that mean?" She drew a breath. "It means I'm leaving." The words hung in the air like a storm warning. Thomas stood frozen, perplexed. He did not shout. He did not argue. He said only, "Leaving? Where to?" Eveline nodded toward the suitcase at the foot of the stairs. "I'm going to Nora's house. Then maybe to my grandmother's chalet. I don't know yet. All I know is that this is no longer my home." His gaze was calculated, as though assessing logistics rather than emotion. "You're overreacting," he said. "You're going to throw everything away over a messed-up breakfast?" Eveline let out a small laugh. "You still think it's about breakfast?" She did not expect apologies or pleas, but perhaps she'd hoped one last time he would say her name tenderly. Something like, "Eveline, please," or "Stay," but it did not come. Instead, Thomas folded his arms and asked, "What do you want me to say? That I lied? That I regret it?" "I can't." Eveline swallowed. "Don't say anything. Just accept it, because I'm done explaining myself, done justifying, done begging for attention." He remained silent, and that silence, for the first time, tasted like freedom. Eveline grabbed her suitcase, walked through the doorway, and didn't look back. Nora greeted her with the same embrace she always gave, firm, without judgment or questions. "The room is yours for as long as you need," she said, pointing to the back suite. It was small, with a single bed covered in a crocheted bedspread and a floral lamp on the nightstand. To anyone else, it would be a temporary place, but to Eveline, it was a sanctuary. There were no voices demanding things, no expectations, only silence, but a different kind of silence, one that made space, one that let you breathe. That first night, Eveline couldn't sleep. She sat at the old desk beside the bed, opened the burgundy journal, and wrote in trembling hand, "I'm not sad. Not exactly. I'm waking up, and it hurts, because waking from anesthesia is always confusing. But I'd rather this pain than numbness." She closed the journal, lay down, and lay awake for hours, listening to the sound of leaves rustling outside, as if nature itself whispered, "Yes, now it's you." In the days that followed, Eveline helped Nora with small tasks. She washed dishes, organized bookshelves, went to the market, but she did everything with an unfamiliar lightness, without fear of mistakes, without waiting for approval. One morning she stepped onto the porch with a cup of tea and stayed there for nearly an hour, simply watching light dance on the leaves, a sensation she hadn't allowed herself in years. For the first time in so long, she felt no rush, and that absence of urgency was, for her, the clearest sign she was on the right path. One afternoon, While tidying the guest room drawers out of habit, Eveline discovered a small carved wooden box. It belonged to Nora, tucked among old blankets and magazines. Curious, she opened it gently. Inside were watercolor brushes, a few worn tubes of paint, and pieces of textured paper. Nora found her kneeling beside the box and smiled. It was my brother's. He painted to forget the world. Feel free to use it. Eveline hesitated. She didn't know how to paint, never learned. But in that moment, it wasn't about skill. It was about trying. The next morning, she opened one of the papers, dipped a brush in water, and tried a stroke of blue, then green. The movements were erratic, uncoordinated, but there was beauty in the disorder. She painted not to depict something, but to feel something. It was like opening windows in walls long sealed. The colors made no sense, but they didn't have to. When she finished, she looked at the smudge before her and whispered, "This is mine." It wasn't art for display. It was art for breathing. That week, Eveline returned to the community library she hadn't visited in years. She checked out books on pottery, gardening, and watercolor. She signed her full name on the loan card in firm handwriting, Eveline G. Harper. On her way out, she ran into an old acquaintance from the reading club. The woman greeted her with a surprised look. "You look different. More alive, maybe." Eveline thanked her without explanation, because for the first time, she no longer needed to justify changes only she understood. Her days became silent rituals: early morning tea, a walk to the organic market, afternoon reading beneath the arbor, timid brush strokes on quiet nights. Eveline bought a new pot for her favorite plant, a succulent she'd rescued at the last minute from her old house. She placed it on the bedroom windowsill, where the morning sun first touched it. It was a symbol, she knew, of resilience, of surviving with little, but also of blossoming, albeit late. Noah called often, always with a gentle voice, always asking if she needed anything. When he offered financial help, she politely declined. "What I need now can't be bought, my son. It's space." Sarah, on the other hand, sent sparse messages, always brief. "Dad asked if you'll come back. Are you okay? Is all this really necessary?" Eveline replied when she felt like it, and sometimes left messages unread, because she learned that absence is also a form of communication. One evening, while walking alone on a short trail in the nearby park, Eveline saw a little girl stacking stones into precarious towers. The mother watched from a distance, absorbed in her phone. Eveline crouched a few feet away, feigning interest in the grass, but really watching the child. The girl piled 3 stones, 4, 5, then everything tumbled down, and she began again. Eveline smiled at the scene. That was it, she thought. That was what she was doing too, stacking what remained to build something new even if unstable. On her way back, she paused before the window of a small craft shop. Among crochet pieces and floral paintings, a handwritten sign read, "Beginner wood carving, sign up." She smiled, unhurried, and went inside. She filled out the form, paid in cash. When the clerk asked if she'd bring someone, Eveline replied, "No, this is just for me." And she said it with a conviction she hadn't felt in years. Eveline didn't know wood carving, but now, knowing how was secondary. What mattered was to carve something, even if it was herself. Back at Nora's house, she climbed the stairs lightly, took a hot bath, put on the plush robe her friend gave her, and sat at the desk. She opened the burgundy journal, but this time she didn't write sorrow. She wrote intentions. "I want to paint the chalet's porch, light yellow. I want to plant lavender. I want to learn to bake bread. I want to spend a day without speaking and not feel lonely." She closed the journal, certain these were not empty promises but plans, small, but finally her own. It took Thomas exactly 2 weeks to call, and it wasn't an apology. It was a curt phone call at 3:17 p.m. on a Monday. "Do you have any idea where the car insurance papers are?" he asked, as though she were still in the next room. Eveline answered calmly, "In the desk drawer, where they always have been." There was a silence. He murmured, "Right," and hung up. He didn't ask how she was, nor where she was. But that first contact said it all. He was beginning to stumble over spaces she used to organize without notice. Days later, he called again. "Do you remember where we kept last year's income tax documents?" Eveline drew a deep breath before replying, In the blue folder, inside the filing box, in the laundry room cabinet. And before hanging up, she added, "You might want to write that down this time. I won't be there forever." He said nothing, but the next call came in less than 48 hours. This time, it was about the lamb stew recipe Grace, his daughter, requested. He didn't even know where to begin, and Eveene, for the first time, didn't give him the recipe. "You can look it up online. It's easy." And she hung up. It was at that point she realized something essential. Her absence was not a void. It was a mirror, and Thomas, confronted with it, began to see all the parts of life she'd sustained alone, with silence, invisible, gestures, and constant presence. Nora, ever perceptive, commented, "He doesn't miss you. He misses the comfort you provided." Eveline agreed with a wry smile. But that's a kind of recognition too, even if belated. One Saturday afternoon, returning from her carving class, Eveline found an unmarked envelope slipped under Nora's door. It was from her old house. The name Eveline, written in firm, masculine letters. Inside was a letter, 2 handwritten pages. It was from Thomas. It said, "Among other things, I read some of the letters in your journal, the ones you left behind. I had no idea, or perhaps I did and chose not to see." Eveline read it with a tight chest but without tears. There were no requests for reconciliation, no justifications. Only one line echoing as a final gesture of humanity. "You've always been better than I ever recognized." She did not reply, nor did she need to. That letter wasn't the start of reconciliation. It was the period at the end of a poorly written sentence. Yet she kept the envelope, not out of longing, but for dignity. It was the least he could offer, acknowledgement. And for her, who spent decades without even a genuine thank you, it was more than she'd ever expected. Eveline returned to her day as if nothing had changed, but inside her, something settled. An old part, marked by doubt, finally rested. Noah was the first to visit the chalet. He arrived with a basket of bread and a cheap bottle of wine, his head bowed. "I thought we could talk without rush." Eveline greeted him with the same warm hug as always, but this time with firmer eyes. They walked together around the land she was beginning to reclaim, timid flowers sprouting, paint cans by the porch, the smell of baking bread drifting from inside. Noah stood silent for a few minutes. Then he said, "I didn't know, Mom. Really, I'm sorry I never asked." She nodded. "It's okay now. I took too long to ask myself, too." At day's end, they sat on the porch watching the sun turn, the distant lake golden. Noah held her hand and said, "You look free." Eveline smiled with teary eyes. "I'm learning, and it's a new feeling. Frightening, but good." When he left a note on the table with few words. "If you need anything, call me. This time I'll answer." Eveline slipped the note between the pages of her burgundy journal, not out of necessity, but out of affection. That night, she wrote a new entry. "Today, for the first time, I looked at my life without wanting to rewrite it. I accepted what was. I loved what I could. I was wrong in what I held in. But now, there is no longer imposed silence, only choice." She closed the journal, turned off the light, and fell asleep to the sound of the trees swaying in the wind. For the first time in decades, she slept without feeling indebted to anyone. Eveline woke to the first rays of sun piercing the chalet window. Birds chirped among the trees, and the air carried the damp scent of earth, mingled with the perfume of newly planted lavender. She padded into the kitchen barefoot, took the clay mug she had shaped in pottery class, and brewed apple cinnamon tea. With each small gesture, she felt more connected to her own life. Solitude, which once hurt like a wound, now felt like a blank page, ready to be filled with new stories, this time written by her. That morning, Eveline decided she would paint the porch. She chose a shade between pale yellow and cream, soft as morning light. She donned the floral apron Nora had given her, grabbed the paint roller, and began. Each brushstroke was an affirmation. "This is mine. I decide." Between pauses and sips of tea, she smiled to herself. She was there, present, alive, at peace. There was no one to watch, correct, or judge. She was no longer the shadow of a married woman. She was, at last, a whole woman. When she finished the first coat, she sat on the doorstep and admired the result. imperfect, but radiant, like everything that is real. That same afternoon, she received an unexpected message. It was from Sarah. Long, insecure. Dad showed me what you wrote. I had no idea, Mom. I only saw things from his side. I'm so sorry. I'd like to come see you if you'll let me. Eveline read every word calmly. She didn't reply right away. She went for a walk. She needed her emotions to settle. When she returned, she wrote a short but sincere note. I'm rebuilding carefully. If you come lightly. We can walk together, but I can't carry anyone. Right now. She sent it without hesitation. For the first time, without fear of seeming cold. It was simply the truth. Sarah arrived 2 days later, alone. No children, no rush. She carried a bag of bread, a scented candle, and a humble bouquet of wildflowers. Eveline greeted her with a gentle smile. They sat in the garden, hands busy trimming dead branches while they talked about everything and nothing. Sarah hesitated, offering fragmented apologies, recounting distorted memories. Eveline didn't correct her. She simply listened. Then, in a moment of silence, Sarah said, You've always been so strong, and I mistook that for indifference. I wanted to be like you. Eveline smiled softly. Strength sometimes is just a pretty name for survival. That night, they cooked together. There was no tension, just two women learning to coexist anew. When Sarah left, she hugged her mother tightly. If you'd like, I can come back to help plant those hydrangeas you mentioned. Eveline nodded, but she knew that even if Sarah didn't return, everything would still be all right. Because now she no longer depended on that. She had herself. And that was enough. She went back inside, settled on the sofa with a blanket around her shoulders, and opened the burgundy journal. On a fresh page, she wrote, I am surrounded by possibilities, and I don't need all of them to come true to feel whole. Thomas never called again. After his letter, the silence remained, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the suffocating silence of being ignored, but the space left by someone who had finally recognized he'd lost something precious. And that was enough. Eveline sought no punishment. She didn't want to see him suffer. She only wanted him to know. She existed, and she was no small thing. No exaggeration. No burden. She only loved too much, and at last, loved herself enough to leave. One evening, while organizing papers, she found her great-aunt's ancient will. Among the clauses, a handwritten note read, This chalet is for Eveline, because she always saw beauty in simple things. May she never forget that. She read those words with tears in her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had said something so kind, unconditionally, without demands. She tucked the paper into a clear folder and smiled. The most important inheritance wasn't the house itself, but the reminder that she had always had roots. She just needed to return to them. Eveline stepped outside and sat on the porch steps. The sky was clear, studded with timid stars. The lavender swayed in the breeze, exuding its delicate scent. She opened the journal and wrote in firm, deliberate letters, Today I did not cry. I did not smile all the time, but I was whole. And that is enough. She closed the journal gently, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the urge to tell her story. Perhaps to other women, perhaps in a book, or maybe just to herself. But she knew. What she had lived would not be in vain. If you've ever felt invisible in your own story, leave a comment saying where you're watching from. And if this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters.